fall for various forms of paranormal woo-woo, such as possession by the devil, extrasensory perception, ghosts and spirits, witches, and spiritual energy in mountains, trees, and crystals. So the puzzle is, if people can be rational, why does humanity seem to be losing its mind? So this was the text that I took up in my book, Rationality. Now there is a standard answer to the nature of rationality and irrationality coming from my own field, cognitive psychology, and the neighboring field of behavioral economics, which is rationality itself may be defined by normative models. These are benchmarks for how we ought to reason. And in my book Rationality, in a course that I teach at Harvard, I try to convey what I think are the 7 cognitive tools or normative models that every educated person ought to master. They include logic, probability, Bayesian reasoning, that is calibrating a degree of credence in an idea according to strength of evidence, theory of rational choice or expected utility, statistical decision theory, also known as signal detection theory, that is how do you make a decision when it depends on noisy inputs and the different ways of being wrong have different costs and benefits. Game theory, how does a rational agent choose a course of action when the outcome depends on the choices of other rational agents. And the analysis of correlation and causation, which, as I mentioned, and as I assume you all know, owes tremendously to the foundational work of Judea Pearl. And in his honor, I will reproduce a correlation and causation joke that I used to explain the concept in my book Rationality. And it's about a couple who is experiencing sexual frustration in a traditional Jewish community, and it is written in Jewish law that a man is responsible for his wife's sexual pleasure. This is true. So they approach the rabbi. They tell him of their problem, and the rabbi strokes his beard and he says, well, here's an idea you can try. Hire a handsome, young, athletic man to wave a towel over you the next time you make love, and the fantasies will help the missus achieve satisfaction. Completely kosher. And so they try it, and the earth doesn't move. Nothing happens. So they go back to the rabbi. The rabbi strokes his beard again, and he says, well, this time let's try a slight variation. This time, the young man will make love to your wife, and you wave the towel. So they try it, and sure enough, she has an ecstatic, screaming orgasm. And the husband turns to the man and says, schmuck, now that's the way you wave a towel. That's a joke about correlation and causation. And in fact, our host, Professor Pearl, can explain mathematically the fallacy in the husband's reason. Okay, well, according to the standard approach, again, this is what the majority of cognitive psychologists and behavioral economics believe, humans don't naturally reason with these normative models, but we fall back on heuristics, biases, and primitive intuitions, resulting in widespread fallacies. Many of you are familiar with this work, often associated with the late Daniel Kahneman, author of the bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow, and his late collaborator Amos Tversky. So the solution is greater promotion of numeracy and scientific literacy, better science and math education. So let me just give you some examples of some classic human fallacies. These are phenomena that have been demonstrated in the lab and in countless classrooms over a course of 60 years, highly replicable. So here's a classic example of logical reasoning. Consider a deck of cards in which every card has a number on one side and a letter on the other. Here is a possible rule. If a card has a D on one side, it has a 3 on the other. Which of the following cards do you have to turn over to test whether that rule holds of this deck of cards? So you've got a D, you've got an F, you've got a 3, and you've got a 7. So which cards do you have to turn over to test whether the rule is satisfied? Okay, this has been done hundreds of times since the 1960s. And the most popular answers are you have to turn over the D card or you have to turn over the D and the 3 card. I haven't asked for a show of hands, but I suspect That's what occurred to many of you in this room, because it is very replicable. The correct answer is you have to turn over the D card and the 7 card. Well, how come? Well, everyone knows you've got to turn over the D card, because if you turned it over and there wasn't a 3, that would falsify the rule. Everyone knows you don't have to turn over the F card. The rule doesn't say anything about it one way or another. A lot of people think you have to turn over the 3 card, but when you think about it, that's irrelevant. The rule says if D, then 3, not if 3, then D. Thinking that you have to turn over the 3 card is an example of the fallacy of affirming the consequent, that is, going from P, if P then Q to if Q then P, which is a fallacy. And when you think about it, you really do have to turn over the 7 card, because if you turned it over and there's a D on the other side, that would falsify the rule. But it doesn't occur to most people. It's a common explanation, really more of a redescription, is that it's a case of confirmation bias. That is, that people are pretty good at looking for examples that conform with a generalization. They're not so good at looking for potentially disconfirming confirmatory examples. Let me give you another classic example, this one from Bayesian inference. The probability that a woman has breast cancer is 1%. If a woman does have breast cancer, the probability that she tests positive is 90%. That's the sensitivity of the test. If she does not have cancer, the probability that she nevertheless tests positive is 9%. That's the false positive rate. A woman tests positive. What is the chance that she actually has the disease? Okay, just think about it intuitively in terms of the ballpark probability that you would assign. Well, in samples of physicians, the average answer is about a probability of 80 to 90%. The correct answer is 9%. That's right, when you go to a doctor and you test positive, chances are the doctor will overestimate the chance that you have the disease by a factor of about 10. A common explanation is that this shows that people tend to neglect base rates. In this case, the fact that only 1% of people in the population have the disease in the first case, which means that most of the positives are going to be false positives. They only think about representative stereotypes, that is, a person with cancer probably will test positive, but they fail to discount that by how rare it is in the population, namely the base rate. I'll give you one other example of, or set of examples of common fallacies in human reasoning. And this consists of intuitions that people naturally have about how the world works, that served our ancestors well in a pre-scientific environment, but which often have been debunked by our best science. For example, I'll give you 3 of those intuitions. Many people are vulnerable to dualistic thinking, that is, to thinking that every human being has a body and has a mind. And it's a natural way to think. As we interact with one another, we don't treat each other as hunks of meat or robots. We assume that the person we're dealing with has a mind with beliefs and desires and intentions just like ours, even though we can't experience them directly. Well, once you think that there can be bodies plus minds, it's a short step to imagine, well, there can be minds without bodies. And so you get beliefs in spirits and souls and ghosts and an afterlife and reincarnation and ESP. We're also prone to essentialist thinking. That is, that living things contain an invisible essence that gives them their form and powers. You can't see it directly, but it's what organizes the living, working tissues of organic beings. Well, there's a short step to conclude that disease must be caused by some kind of adulteration of one's essence by a foreign contaminant or pollutant. And so you get resistance to vaccines, as old as vaccines themselves, because when you think about it intuitively, what is a vaccine? You're actually taking the substance that makes you sick and injecting it deep into your tissues. It's not surprising that many people think that that is an icky prospect. It makes people receptive to homeopathy and herbal remedies, which seem to be transfusing the healthful essence of a living thing into the body. And it leads to the widespread rediscovery in culture after culture of quack cures like purging and vomiting and enemas and bloodletting and fasting, and the vague sense that to treat disease, you've got to get rid of toxins, whatever they are. Then we also are prone to teleological intuitions. We know that our own plans, our own artifacts and tools and creations were designed with a purpose. From there, it's a short step to assume that the whole world was designed for a purpose, and so to be receptive to creationism and astrology and synchronicity and the vague Oprah-esque sense that everything happens for a reason. So, can human irrationality be explained by these heuristics, fallacies, and primitive intuitions, the subject matter of a lot of cognitive psychology? And as a corollary, can we cure it by promoting logic, numeracy, and scientific literacy? This suggestion has found its way into cartoons such as this SMBC cartoon whose caption is, "This is why people should learn statistics." The woman says, "I will not fly in a plane, they aren't safe from terrorists." Hold on, I'll text you an article about it. Or a headline from the satirical newspaper The Onion, CDC announces plan to send every US household pamphlet on probabilistic thinking. This is a comforting idea for those of us who teach science and statistics and cognitive psychology and so on. But I've come to realize that the answer of the question, is this the way to cure scientific illiteracy, is unfortunately no. And let me give you a couple of illustrations as to why not. So let me give you an example from logic. The question is this syllogism valid, which is to say, does the conclusion follow logically from the premises? So the premises are, if college admissions are fair, then affirmative action laws are no longer necessary. College admissions are not fair, therefore affirmative action laws are necessary. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Okay. The answer is no. This is an example of the fallacy of denying the antecedent. That is, of going from if P, then Q, to if not P, then not Q, which is a logical fallacy. And when people are given this problem, a majority of liberals commit the fallacy, but a majority of conservatives do not. Now, if you ask conservatives what's the explanation, they'll say, well, it's just what we told you all along. Liberals are irrational. Not so fast. How about this syllogism? If less severe punishments deter people from committing crime, then capital punishment should not be used. Less severe punishments do not deter people from committing crime, therefore capital punishment should be used. Well, now a majority of conservatives commit the fallacy, and a majority of liberals do not. And of course, what is happening is the same thing on both sides. Namely, people start out with the conclusion that they want to believe is true because it is a kind of signature or calling card of their own political coalition, and they will think that any train of reasoning that leads to some conclusion that they wanted to be true in the first place is valid. Let me turn now to a test of climate literacy. That is the science behind climate change, and ask you whether each of these statements is true or false. Climate scientists believe that if the North Pole ice cap melted as a result of global warming, sea levels would rise. Okay, true or false? What gas do most scientists believe causes temperatures in the atmosphere to rise? Carbon dioxide, hydrogen, helium, or radon. Climate scientists believe that human-caused global warming will increase the risk of skin cancer in human beings. One of the causes of global warming is a hole in the ozone layer. And one of the ways to mitigate climate change is to clean up toxic waste dumps. Okay? Now, it turns out that these statements are all false. If global warming resulted in the melting of ice caps on Greenland and Antarctica, that would cause sea level rise. But the North Pole ice caps are floating on water to begin with, and their melting would no more raise sea levels than if an ice cube in your Coke melted, it would cause the cup of Coke to overflow. Likewise, ozone hole is or was a serious environmental problem, but it is completely independent of climate change. Toxic waste dumps have nothing to do with it. When you give this test to a sample of people, the believers in anthropogenic climate change don't score any better than the deniers. Many of the believers have a vague sense of green and natural versus pollution and contamination, and they're not particularly astute as to the actual science behind climate change. So what does lead to science denial? The answer is actually pretty simple. Politics, political orientation. Why is the Earth getting warmer? If you ask people, is it because of human activity or natural patterns, you find that the more conservative, the more climate denial. It has nothing to do with scientific literacy, no understanding of atmospheric chemistry. It's just politics. The farther to the right, the more climate denial. Similarly, when it comes to denial of the proposition that humans evolved from other organisms, the degree of belief in that proposition is completely uncorrelated with tests of scientific literacy, like what is bigger, an atom or an electron, probes of how well people understand Darwin's theory of natural selection, completely uncorrelated with their belief as to whether humans evolved from other primates. What predicts belief in evolution is just religiosity. The more religious, the more you deny evolution. These are findings that come from the legal scholar Daniel Kahan, who calls it expressive rationality. Namely, opinions can be signals of loyalty to a social group or coalition. It turns out that despite our laments of rampant scientific illiteracy, most scientific findings are accepted. In contrast to, say, the consensus a few hundred years ago, very few people in the mainstream of American society today believe in werewolves, unicorns, animal sacrifice, bloodletting, the divine right of kings, miasmas as the explanation of disease, or omens and eclipses and comets. Pick your favorite kooky politician, chances are they will not endorse any of these statements. There's only a few politicized, emotionally charged topics which become kind of talismans or litmus tests of political loyalty, and that's where you find the science denial. So how do we achieve feats of rationality despite both the cognitive biases that cognitive psychologists have documented, and then on top of them, all the political biases? Well, the general answer, and this was hinted at by Professor Pearl, is that there's a kind of social rationality, that there are some institutions that by their very design promote rationality, and that's how, as a species, we've managed to accomplish anything rational. Because really, few of us can really justify our beliefs, including the true beliefs. I've been vaccinated against COVID 6 times. If you ask me how the vaccines work, I'll say something mRNA, something immune system, something antibodies. Basically, I trust the people in the white coats who say that they're safe and effective. So we depend, all of us, on the expertise of scientists, historians, journalists, government record keepers, and mainstream authors. And the trust is often well placed because in a well-designed rationality-promoting institution, one person can notice and make up for another's biases. They can make us collectively more rational than any of us is individually. We all are very poor at spotting fallacies and biases in ourselves. We're much, much better at spotting fallacies and biases than the other guy. And so if you have a community where people can point out each other's fallacies, can express hypotheses, keep the ones that seem to withstand criticism and attacks, not repeat the errors of the past, then the species can inch its way toward greater rationality. So let me give you a concrete example. Remember the card selection task in Deed and 3? As I mentioned, when people are given this problem to solve, about 1 in 10 gets it right. But if you put them in groups of 3 and 4, now 7 out of the 10 get it right. All it takes is for one person to spot the correct answer and explain it to everyone else, and the rest of the group virtually always agrees. What do I mean by rationality promoting institutions? Well, in fact, Professor Pearl mentioned 2 of them, starting with science with its demand for empirical testing and peer review, democratic government with its checks and balances, journalism with its demand for editing and fact-checking, the judicial system with its adversarial proceedings, even Wikipedia, probably the most successful social media, with it, where the editors have to sign on to 5 pillars of objectivity, neutrality, and sourcing. If you compare it to social media that are kind of a free-for-all, like TikTok and Twitter and Instagram, the record is not as impressive. And in theory, academia, with its commitment to freedom of inquiry and open debate. As I said, in theory, and that's the question that I will turn to now. What it suggests, by the way, in general, our overall set of guidelines for how do we promote rationality is to safeguard the credibility and objectivity of rationality promoting institutions. Experts should be prepared to show their work, that is not to issue edicts from on high as if they were oracles, but to explain the basis of their recommendations. Fallibility should be acknowledged, since we all start out ignorant about everything, and fallibility is part of being rational. And perhaps most important, gratuitous politicization should be avoided, and this is an advisory that our scientific institutions have been rather flamboyant in flouting of recent, where our major scientific magazines and organizations have been falling over themselves to proclaim how aligned they are with the political left. They should not be surprised if the center and the right blows them off. In other words, if we want people to accept the scientific consensus on climate change, vaccines, public health measures, and science in general, they should not be branded as left-wing causes. The final topic then I'll turn to is the question of academic freedom, which is objectively under threat. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, which tracks assaults on academic freedom, found that between the year 2014 and the year 2022, there were 877 attempts to punish scholars for constitutionally protected speech, 114 incidents of censorship, 156 firings, 44 of them tenured professors, more than during the McCarthy era. So here's a graph just showing how the problem rather suddenly got much, much worse. Leading to the puzzle, why should academia, of all institutions, punish the expression of opinion? Isn't that what academia is for? Well, part of the answer comes from the political orientation of university professors, which has become increasingly left-wing. This graph only goes to the year 2014, that was 10 years ago, and if we had comparable data today, there's no question that the leftward shift, as represented by the top line, would be even more extreme, and it isn't because of trends in the general population. The same questions show pretty much a flat line in the population as a whole. I'll present some recent data from an institution with which I'm familiar, Harvard, where, according to the most recent poll, 37% of my colleagues identify themselves as very liberal, 45% as liberal, 16% as moderate, and 1.5% as conservative, and even that figure is going to go down because he's going to retire. So what's the big deal about academic freedom? Now, it's not just to stanch the bleeding of confidence in universities, though that is a problem. Confidence in, trust in universities has been sinking faster than any other American institution. That's saying a lot, considering how much trust has eroded in the media, government, and so on. Fewer than half of Americans believe it has a positive effect on the country. Also, academic freedom should not be defended as a perquisite of professors. Just professors have the right to say whatever they want, because professors are as much a part of the problem as part of the solution. A lot of these cancellations and censorship incidents and firings were at the behest of professors. But it's rather to safeguard rationality itself. No one is infallible or omniscient. That should be obvious. And we've seen evidence of logical and statistical fallacies, primitive intuitions, the my side bias, meaning believing a proposition if it is a signature cause of your own coalition. Expressive rationality, opinions as signs of loyalty to a coalition. Intellectual progress is driven by what Karl Popper called conjecture and refutation, namely some people propose ideas, others probe whether they're sound. In the long run, if the institution is well designed, people keep the ideas that have withstood criticism and attempts at falsification and try not to repeat their mistakes. Any institution that disables this cycle by making certain hypotheses unsaleable is doomed to error. We have many historical examples, such as the embrace of geocentrism, of creationism, of Lamarckism by the Soviet Union, and any institution that just prevents certain opinions from being voiced is bound to provide erroneous guidance on vital issues. Again, since no one's infallible, no one's omniscient. And even when the academic consensus is almost certainly correct, people won't accept it. And I have encountered this a number of times where I will talk about the fact that the vast majority of scientists agree that human activity has been warming the planet. And the response is, well, why should I trust the consensus if it comes from a clique that allows no dissent? Consensus just means that anyone who disagrees will be canceled or driven out. And it is a legitimate criticism. If we want to safeguard the credibility of the scientific consensus, we have to reassure people that it comes from a community where if there are criticisms, they can be voiced and they can be refuted. And so it's in the service of promoting academic freedom as a necessary means to the end of rationality that I and a number of colleagues formed the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, a faculty-led organization devoted to upholding the ideals of free inquiry, intellectual diversity, and civil discourse, again, not as a perquisite of professors, but as one small part in the effort to promote rationality.